On this Thursday night from Quebec City, morning mass interrupted. The Pope confronted by protesters demanding he rescind the Doctrine of Discovery. The story behind the centuries-old edict and why Indigenous communities are calling for it to be cancelled. A Quebec man killed in combat in Ukraine.
Really, we miss him.
His comrades and commander's message to the Canadians' family in a Global News exclusive. Deal or no deal? Moscow responds to Washington's proposed prisoner swap to free 2 Americans. Funds for your firearms. The price the feds are willing to pay to buy back banned weapons.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight from Quebec City, Jeff Semple.
We are looking inside the Notre Dame de Quebec. The Cathedral Basilica is Canada's oldest church, dating back to the 17th century, where, as you can see, Pope Francis met with local and national church leaders tonight, capping off another busy day as we enter the final hours of his historic visit. Good evening and thank you for joining us. We are coming to you again tonight from a rainy Quebec City, just steps from that church in the heart of Old Quebec, on a day that began with morning mass.
In confronting the scandal of evil and the body of Christ wounded in the flesh of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we too have experienced deep dismay. We too feel the burden of failure. Allow me then to join in spirit.
The pontiff acknowledged for the first time on this trip the sexual abuse inflicted on minors and vulnerable people, and he said the church is on a new path. The ceremony was held at the Basilica of Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré on the outskirts of Quebec City. In attendance there, Canadian prime ministers, both past and present, Quebec's premier, and other dignitaries. But most of the 1,400 people in attendance were representatives of Indigenous communities, with residential school survivors seated in the front pews. The Pope will head north to Iqaluit tomorrow, the final stop on his Canadian tour. But as the penitential pilgrimage enters its final hours, some say his apologies and his actions so far have failed to live up to their hopes and expectations. Mike Armstrong was out speaking with those crowds who were outside the church today. So, Mike, the crowd's not quite as big as the organizers had expected, at least. But what did you hear from people about what the day was like for them?
Yeah, it was very emotional for a lot of people, both inside and outside the Basilica. And this is interesting, sometimes for very different reasons.
They may celebrate Mass in every Catholic church in the world, but not like this, with the scars left by residential schools as the focus and addressed by the Pope himself.
Now they understand because nobody knew about us.
Carolyn Longchap says hearing it all exposed helps leave the anger behind.
My children, my grandchildren never knew about this. So I am talking about it now on TV, and I think they're going to be surprised to hear the truth.
Thousands followed the service from outside the Basilica. There was also another spot in Quebec City for more people. But not everyone showed up for the same reason. Paul Dixon turned out on this day to protest, not for the apology.
No. I came here on behalf of the ones that never going to be here, never going to recover their childhood days or teenagers lost in those Indian prisons, so-called schools.
Now, the goal of this trip wasn't to put up big numbers. It wasn't about the crowds. It was about residential schools. But it's still been hard not to be struck by how small the crowds have been. The last papal visit to this city was in 1984. Pope John Paul held Mass for an estimated 300,000 people. This visit has been different, but so is this Pope.
He has kind of like shaken the carpet and like all the dirt's coming out.
Social worker Lorena Figueroa came from Toronto. She says Pope Francis's time as the leader of the church has been focused on some painful jobs, exposing and repairing some of the church's mistakes.
Like, you just say, like a cleanse. And you know what a cleanse isn't always like, okay, so you have a scar or a wound, you really hurt yourself. You got to clean it, and it hurts, and it's horrible.
Now, this visit hasn't been about growing the church or prophesizing, it's been about apologizing. So even though the crowds have been somewhat smaller, that doesn't mean they haven't been important, especially for the people that they've been supposed to be for.
Yeah. All right, Mike Armstrong with us in Quebec City tonight. Thanks, Mike. And the Pope's morning mass was interrupted at one point by Indigenous protesters demanding action on a long-standing issue. Protesters unveiled a banner that read, "Rescind the Doctrine." Now, that is a reference to the so-called Doctrine of Discovery, a 15th century edict that the church and governments used to justify their seizure of Indigenous lands. The protesters were escorted out of the church, where they continued their demonstration outside. The Prime Minister and Pontiff are said to have discussed that centuries-old edict in their meeting this week, and Canada's Catholic bishops confirm they are working with the Vatican on a plan to address that issue. Neetu Garcha has more on the doctrine's devastating impact and the growing calls to rescind it.
Grand Chief Herb Norwegian says the way he and his people consume the land's resources is still dictated in large part by the Doctrine of Discovery.
It was a tool that they used to take land from unchristian First Nation people.
The philosophy was used to legitimize the colonization of Indigenous peoples around the world, dehumanizing, exploiting, and subjugating them of their most basic rights. Chief Norwegian says to this day it informs Canadian and American government policies.
The United States government, the whole Constitution, is basically based on the Doctrine of Discovery.
The root of all evil is that Doctrine of Discovery, and it has to be rescinded.
Georgina Lightning and her daughter Crystal are raising awareness about the ongoing implications through a new documentary called The Doctrine of Recovery.
We need a female-driven story about this doctrine because, you know, all that it has done to us.
No more pretending. Our survival depends upon us caring for our life giver.
The film screened in Edmonton Monday, the same day the Pope failed to address the doctrine in his apology.
I hope that he acknowledges what has happened.
Without, meaningful acts to follow through, it'll just be all for naught.
Elder Claudette Commanda says even after the Canadian government overtly rejected the doctrine by passing Bill C-15 last year, harmonizing the country's laws with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, revoking the doctrine would help eliminate a layer of legal injustice.
Then the courts will no longer use this against us whenever we move forward to plead our inherent rights.
And she says the Pope has the power to take action.
500 plus years, and there was one Pope who made a Doctrine of Discovery. Well, let's fast forward to 500 plus years, and this Pope can make a change. He can revoke that Doctrine of Discovery.
The rest of the Canadian population need to be behind us, and they need to do everything they can to support First Nations on their road to recovery.
Because he says the Pope telling a truthful narrative of the past can create a more hopeful narrative for the future. Neetu Garcha, Global News.
And later in the program, we'll hear from a Mohawk human rights leader on the doctrine and the Pope's visit.
For years now, we've been on a campaign to get the Vatican to revoke the papal bulls that make up the Doctrine of Discovery. And we need the Pope to clarify, change history, to understand that was unjust and abused by states.
And a reminder that if you or someone you know who is a residential school survivor are looking for help, you can call the Residential School Survivors and Family Crisis Line at 1-800-721-0066. Turning now to other news, and we are learning more tonight about the Canadian killed in Ukraine when his unit was ambushed by a Russian tank. Crystal Goomansingh has more on his life, legacy, and an exclusive interview with those who fought alongside him.
He was here to make a difference.
His humanity, goofiness, and politeness are some of the attributes highlighted by his comrades. Emile-Antoine Roy Sirois was killed in action July 18th in Ryhorivka. 30 soldiers from his unit were trying to hold back a Russian advance on the village in eastern Ukraine. He and 3 others were killed while trying to help a wounded soldier.
We just took so much incoming fire. It was mortars, artillery, tanks shooting at us, and everything at once. So yeah, we were expecting more of us to go that day.
The village didn't fall, but the deadly mission resulted in several members terminating their contracts with Ukrainian armed forces.
4 of my best friends died.
Despite the losses, many maintain their resolve.
I'm gonna stay here to the end of my life or to the end of the war.
When Global News met up with some of the soldiers who took part in the mission, they had just held a service for an American who was killed. Oscar left the hospital to attend the memorial, talking about the tragic day with an IV catheter still in his left hand.
They are heroes, and I love them, and I remember them, and they die like soldiers.
Global Affairs Canada is aware of Sirois and is working with the family. His remains are currently in Dnipro, and once Canada provides the right documentation, they'll be transported here to Kyiv for a small service and then shipped home. In a statement to Global News, his mother wrote in part, "Today, Emile-Antoine would surely wish that the world understood by virtue of his actions the importance of returning to more human values."
I'm sorry that I could not save her son.
Ruslan was one of the men who went back to the field to retrieve the Quebecer's body. As one of the commanding officers for the international fighters, he says the man they called Beaver was special.
Big, handsome, soft power, kind of, yeah, and really we miss him.
Sirois came to Ukraine to join the fight in March. He was 31 years old. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, Kyiv.
Russia is responding to a U.S. proposal for a prisoner swap to free 2 Americans. Basketball star Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan are currently in custody in Russia. Now, the Kremlin says it hasn't agreed to any deal and issued a warning. Jennifer Johnson reports.
WNBA star Brittany Griner testified in a Russian court behind bars, explaining she accidentally put vape cartridges containing cannabis oil in her luggage, which led to her arrest and imprisonment 5 months ago.
But I did not intend to smuggle or plan to smuggle anything into Russia.
Back home, the Biden administration revealed a proposed prisoner swap with the Kremlin. That deal would free Griner and Paul Whelan, a corporate executive from Michigan, serving a 16-year sentence in Russia on espionage charges in exchange for Victor Bout, a convicted arms smuggler known as the Merchant of Death.
Every single day that Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner remain behind bars, it is injustice compounded on itself. Our goal is to see these cases resolved just as soon as we can.
President Biden has signed off on the deal despite objections from the U.S. Justice Department. Bout is serving 25 years in an Illinois prison for conspiring to kill Americans by smuggling weapons to use against U.S. forces. While Griner's case has been in the public eye, Whelan's family is anxious to get him home too, and hopeful about this latest news.
It shows that the U.S. government is doing what it can, and also underscores, I think, the fact that there are limits to what the U.S. government can do to bring home Americans.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he will discuss the deal with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in the next few days. It will be the first conversation between the two since Russia invaded Ukraine.
I plan to raise an issue that's a top priority for us. The release of Americans Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner, who've been wrongfully detained and must be allowed to come home.
But as of today, a Kremlin spokesman says there is no deal. Whelan, a former Marine, remains in prison on what the White House says are trumped-up charges. And Griner, who has pleaded guilty, is still facing 10 years in jail for what she calls a mistake. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
A private phone call from Canada's top cop made public. Coming up, what a senior RCMP officer testified at the Nova Scotia massacre inquiry. We are coming to you tonight from Quebec City, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Quebec City, and we are here covering the latest in Pope Francis's Canadian tour, and we're here just steps from the Notre-Dame de Quebec Basilica Cathedral, where the Pope met this evening with local church leaders. The last event of this day, now heading into the final day of his Canadian tour. We'll have more on his trip in just a moment. But turning now to other news, we are learning more tonight about the compensation gun owners could receive under the federal government's mandatory buyback program. A price list has just been released outlining how much money owners of banned firearms can expect. On the higher end, a Swiss Arms SG-550 could net more than $6,200. While an AR-15 would be bought for $1,300. A senior RCMP officer says he believes there was political interference in the investigation into the deadly 2020 mass shooting in Nova Scotia. Chief Superintendent Chris Leather told a public inquiry in Halifax that he received a private phone call from RCMP Commissioner Brenda Luckie asking for details of the killer's firearms. Other RCMP members accused Luckie of trying to force them to reveal the weapon's make and model to help the federal Liberal government justify new legislation.
So then is it your evidence today that you're of the impression there was political interference?
That's my impression.
The Mass Casualty Commission will release its findings in a final report this November. The demands to change the game ahead. Survivors speak out on Hockey Canada's history of abuse. We're back from Quebec City in just a moment. Reaction is pouring in from the hockey world following this week's shocking testimony by top Hockey Canada executives on Parliament Hill. Abigail Beeman reports.
My hope is that this is more like a Me Too moment.
Greg Gilhooly is a survivor of convicted sex offender and former hockey coach Graham James. He's one of the 9 recipients of Hockey Canada settlements totaling $7.6 million, the vast majority connected to James. He believes the organization's maintenance of a fund for victims separate from insurance is a good thing, but says it dropped the ball closing the investigation into the alleged 2018 sexual assault when the victim didn't want to participate further.
We still somehow find a way to investigate a murder without being able to talk to the dead person.
Many are unimpressed by Hockey Canada CEO's testifying he plans to keep his job, including another James survivor, Sheldon Kennedy.
I'm prepared to take on this responsibility for change within our game. I believe I've got the experience to do it.
The people who are making these recommendations for change or promising this change are the same people who weren't worrying about making these changes years ago. They're the same people who have been in power for years.
Issues of abuse within Canada's game aren't limited to Hockey Canada. Canadian Hockey League executives also testified Wednesday.
I would say since the mid-2000s, the leagues have really focused on trying to stamp out that behavior.
Former NHL player Daniel Carcillo takes issue with that as one of the plaintiffs in a class action against the CHL, writing in a statement, "I disagree. I believe that there is a culture of hazing and abuse in the CHL. Systemic failures continue to occur in protecting the children and young people who play in the CHL." While Gilhooly is most frustrated, Hockey Canada claims it wants to change, but doesn't want his help.
I was abused by Graham James and went through Hockey Canada's process. I would have thought there would be a place for me with Hockey Canada to help them do better. And I can't get my phone calls answered.
He fears Hockey Canada is only focused on doing the right thing, so long as the right thing keeps people in their positions of power. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
We're back from Quebec City in just a moment. We heard earlier about the push to rescind the Doctrine of Discovery. I spoke with a Mohawk human rights leader about the doctrine and the Pope's visit. Mr. Kenneth Dear, thank you so much for joining us here. So we're in the final hours of this trip now. He'll leave Quebec City tomorrow, then head north. What do you make of what you've seen and heard so far?
First of all, it's good that the Pope came here and to address the Indigenous peoples. I think that's always significant. He made a very good speech. His apology was pretty good. It could have been better. He still hasn't taken responsibility for the whole church, and he keeps blaming individuals or groups, and really it's the institution of the church that contributed to the residential school abuse, and they haven't acknowledged that. So we're a little disappointed in that. So, but time is still coming. We're not stopping here.
And one of the most common refrains, certainly I've heard from people, is that they appreciate the words, the apology, but they would also like to see some action. Exactly. What would you like to see on that front?
Well, first of all, our delegation came here, the Haudenosaunee External Relations Committee. We came here not to ask for an apology. For years now, we've been on a campaign to get the Vatican to revoke the papal bulls that make up the Doctrine of Discovery. And because these papal bulls is the basis of how states have claimed sovereignty over Indigenous lands. And we need the Pope to clarify, change history, because states still today use the Doctrine of Discovery in court cases against Indigenous peoples.
I gather you met the Pope in person in, I think, 2016. What are your impressions of him and I guess his sincerity, the way he's handled all of it?
Pope Francis, as an individual, is a sincere person, but he also represents an institution. I think the words that he used in Rome last spring, I think those were the lawyers that were talking. I think what you heard here is more of Pope Francis and a little less of the lawyers. However, it's still there. They still won't. The church itself, as an institution, isn't taking responsibility, and that's the lawyers talking. But it was a step forward. It was getting a little bit closer and a little more sincere, and I think you could see a little bit more into the heart of Pope Francis.
How would you summarize the way this trip has gone and the way the Indigenous people of this country have responded to it?
There's a wide range of reaction. There are some people who are ecstatic that he's here and they appreciate his words and his apology, and there's other people on the opposite end would the Pope can't possibly say anything that would satisfy them, and shows the depth of the anger and the mistrust over 500 years that is really ingrained in our peoples about the effect of the church on our people.
And how do we move forward from this? I mean, what happens after the apology?
The revocation of the papal bulls is a good step. It would be a great step because there's just so much damage that's been done to Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and also their spirituality that was taken away from us. An apology is just words. An apology doesn't mean anything unless there's action to it. Many Indigenous peoples, the word apology doesn't exist in their language, and it's what you're supposed to do is make things right, and that's what we're trying to do, is to make things right as much as we can today and into the future.
Kenneth Dear, thank you so much for joining.
You're very welcome.
I really appreciate it. Yeah. And that is Global National for this Thursday. Good night from Quebec City.